Hi, I'm DJ Ware. On this episode of the Cyber Gizmo, I want to talk a little bit about WInTel. It's probably not fair to call it WInTel anymore. It used to mean Windows plus Intel, because AMD is also a partner here, and so is NVidia. At least they have been. So probably it's a much longer name, but this is the name that survived the 80s and the 90s, and part of the early 21st century as well. So there was a time when the words Windows and Intel weren't just brands, they were a promise. I guarantee that a computer on your desk would simply work. I mean, for nearly 3 decades, actually four, the idea defined what it meant to own a PC. It started in the early 80s when IBM launched the IBM PC that was powered by Intel's 8088 processor, and it ran MS-DOS. From a small company then called Microsoft. It was open enough that competitors built IBM-compatible clones. And all those clones needed two things. They needed a Microsoft operating system and an Intel CPU. So Intel kept making faster processors. There was the 186, the 286, 386, 486, the Pentiums. Microsoft built a new interface on top of DOS, and they called it Windows. In the early days, it was nothing more than a bolt-on to MS-DOS, but it eventually came out on its own. The 1990s were kind of the golden era. That's when the Pentium chips became household names. Microsoft owned the desktop with Windows 98, Windows 2000, and finally Windows XP. Those were all well-liked and well-loved by people that use Windows, although XP eventually turned out to be a real security nightmare because of the shortcuts that Microsoft had taken in getting TCP/IP to work. But WInTel wasn't just technology, it was a culture. The Windows startup chime became the sound of daily life. Classrooms were filled with beige towers. Offices were filled with screensavers. Developers wrote for Windows because it was everywhere and they could sell their software. PC makers used Intel because it was the standard. I mean, it was the standard for everything, not just for the CPU, but also for the motherboard and the devices that plugged into it. The cycle fed itself, and each machine sold made the partnership harder to dislodge. IBM found that out with the PS2. They attempted to do just that. They attempted to regain control of the clones that they had lost, and they lost that battle. But cracks were coming. Windows Vista in 2007 stumbled, and in that same year, Apple released the iPhone. First, it looked like a gadget, but it was the beginning of something bigger. Smartphones and tablets slowly started nibbling at the edges of the PC empire. Still, WInTel held on, and Windows 7 came out. That redeemed Microsoft, and Intel's core processors kept the PC fast and familiar. Through 2010, the odds were overwhelming that any computer that you launched ran Windows on Intel.
The glory of WInTel's rise makes what came next harder to spot. For years, it all looked the same. Intel stickers on laptops, Windows logos on startup, but beneath the surface, the giants slowed. They didn't fall, not yet. They just stopped moving forward. And in tech, standing still is how you fall behind. For Intel, the stall had a number 14 nanometers. In 2014, they launched the 14 nanometers process node and then got stuck there for years. Instead of new breakthroughs, Intel kept refreshing the same chips. 14 Onum++, 14 Onum+++, even 14 Onum++++ became punchlines. Whole product lines launched and died while Intel struggled to get to 10 nanometers, then 7 nanometers. Meanwhile, AMD surged ahead with Ryzen and EPYC. Apple ditched Intel entirely, building its own M1 ARM chips and proving how far Intel had fallen. Microsoft's stall looked different. Windows 7, released in 2009, was beloved, but around it were stumbles. Windows Vista was bloated and hated. Windows 8 ripped away the start menu for a touch-first design no one asked for. Users revolted. Microsoft jumped to Windows 10 in 2015, calling it the last version of Windows. But it wasn't. Windows 11 arrived with stricter hardware rules and a lukewarm reception. Many stayed on Windows 10, and now as Windows 10 support ends in late 2025, millions face buying new PCs or losing updates, and they're angry about it. Leadership shifts only added to the drift. After Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer drove sales but made high-profile missteps, from the Nokia acquisition to the failed Windows Phone push. Then Satya Nadella pivoted Microsoft to the cloud. Financially brilliant, Azure made Microsoft one of the most valuable companies in the world, but Windows quietly slipped from flagship to afterthought. Meanwhile, big bets fizzled. Windows on ARM never matched Apple's M-series success. The new wave of AI PCs landed softly with Copilot features that felt like gimmicks, not game changers. And while Intel stalled on chips and Microsoft stalled on Windows, the world changed. Smartphones ate the PC's lunch. Email, shopping, streaming, even work moved to the phone. The desktop didn't die, but it lost its monopoly on everyday life. That was dangerous for WINTel because Intel didn't make phone chips, and Microsoft never nailed phone software. By the mid-2010s, cracks were obvious. By the 2020s, they were widening. Intel was still refreshing old silicon. Microsoft was still hinting at Windows 12, while Windows 11 failed to inspire the loyalty of Windows 7 or XP. This wasn't collapse, not yet. But the unstoppable momentum of the 90s was gone. Intel and Microsoft were still standing, just standing still. And in tech, that's the same as falling behind.
The slowdown at Intel and Microsoft might have been survivable. Intel could have broken free of the 14 nanometer problem. Microsoft could have rebounded after Windows 11, but then came the cuts, and the slowdown turned into something sharper. Intel's cut was the loudest, 25,000 jobs gone, over 25% of their total employees. Whole teams erased, projects shuttered. Not a few hundred jobs, but tens of thousands. Cuts that deep aren't just realignment. They're a signal that the old way is over, and the company isn't sure what comes next. The timing is brutal. Intel is banking on its 14A manufacturing process to power its next generation of CPUs. That leap, it claims, will put it back in the race with TSMC and Samsung by 2027. But how do you build that future after cutting a quarter of your workforce? I've never seen that successful. The layoffs didn't just hit factories, they hit research, marketing, and software, all the things that drive innovation to product development and product offerings. One of the casualties was Clear Linux. Intel's own Linux distro was a quiet masterpiece. It was blazingly fast, ahead of its time, full of innovations, and other distributions are just now starting to copy it. But the development of it is gone. So it's going to fall to somebody else. Fortunately, there are distributions that are beginning to pick it up. Casio OS is picking it up. Aaron OS is the founder of Aaron OS is one of the main developers from Clear Linux. Yeah, Fedora is picking it up. Also, there's Bazite too, which also has some basis in Clear Linux. But Intel's vision for Linux it was to showcase its hardware, and it's been swept away. Yeah, I mean, what does Intel think runs their back end? What operating system they think it runs on? Microsoft made cuts of its own, 9,000 jobs. Entire Xbox studios were shuttered. Games were canceled in mid-development. Windows initiatives were paused. Azure is thriving, and Microsoft is wildly profitable with that. And that's what made the cuts unsettling. They weren't about survival. They were deliberate. These choices said something. Windows isn't Microsoft's heartbeat anymore. The layoffs didn't just mean fewer coders. They meant roads that are not being taken, features that'll never be built, and projects that could have made PCs exciting again quietly erased. This is where Intel and Microsoft stories kind of braid together again, not in triumph, but in re-entrenchment. Two companies that once defined personal computing are now defining what can be cut. Intel trimming to chase a manufacturing dream with fewer hands. Microsoft trimming to feed the cloud while Windows coasts. Layoffs always come with the promise of freeing up resources, and anyone who's watched tech knows the truth. Layoffs kill momentum. They hollow out the middle, the engineers who remember why a project existed, the designers who push for what if ideas, the logos stay, the machines keep running, but the people who made WinTel, the dreamers, the builders, they're packing their desks. And all this is happening while the ground under the desktop is shifting. Phones have already eaten half of the jobs the PCs used to do. Tablets tried to take more, but even they have faded. If you look at any current marketing research, the tablet has gone absolutely nowhere. Each generation grows up swiping instead of typing. The market shrinks, and when it shrinks, the companies cut. But what goes first? The future bets, clear Linux, bold new Windows features, studios that might have made the next big game?
But today, we have so much exciting news to share with you. I'd like to go ahead and get started.
For years, AMD was the punchline of the CPU world, the budget option, the brand you bought when you couldn't afford Intel. By the late 2000s, they were staggering. Their chips ran hotter, slower, and offered less. Their stock price sank under $2. No one thought they could challenge Intel again. And then Lisa Su took over. In 2014, Su became AMD's CEO, and instead of trying to win everything at once, she focused. That focus had one name: Zen. Zen was a brand new CPU architecture, a complete redesign. When it launched in 2017 as Ryzen, it shocked the industry. Suddenly, AMD had real performance, lots of cores and affordable prices. Gamers noticed, builders noticed, reviewers noticed. AMD was back, but Ryzen wasn't a one-off. Zen became a roadmap. Zen 2, Zen 3, Zen 4, each generation faster, each one proving AMD's comeback was real. Here's the key. AMD didn't cling to its own factories. While Intel got stuck making its own chips on the same 14 nanometers node for nearly a decade, AMD outsourced manufacturing to TSMC, and it saved them. AMD focused on design. TSMC handled the silicon. While Intel was stuck on 14 nanometers, AMD shipped 7 nanometers Ryzen chips, and customers could feel the difference. AMD didn't just reclaim the desktop. They pushed into places Intel had owned for decades. Servers. Intel's Xeon chips once ruled the data center, but AMD's EPYC line offered more cores for less money and started winning over cloud providers and enterprises. Consoles. Both the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 run on AMD silicon. Millions of households are using AMD hardware, even if they don't know it. By the early 2020s, AMD wasn't the cheap alternative anymore. They were making Intel sweat. Ryzen CPUs were in gaming rigs and workstations. EPIC was reshaping the cloud. Radeon GPUs, while not always beating NVidia, were at least keeping the GPU giant honest. This wasn't an overnight miracle. It was slow, relentless, disciplined. Lisa Su's AMD stayed lean and focused CPU architecture, GPU relevance, and smart partnerships. No bloated spending, no vanity projects, no sprawling into markets they couldn't win. And it worked. By 2023, AMD's value had soared. Their CPUs topped benchmarks. Their server chips were gaining share. Their console deals kept them in living rooms. The lesson is bigger than AMD. Intel's mistake was pride, believing they could do everything themselves forever. AMD's salvation was humility, letting TSMC fab their chips, focusing on what they could win, and delivering, year after year. AMD isn't flawless. Their GPUs still trail NVIDIA's top cards, but they've done the impossible. They turned a punchline into a powerhouse. Intel lost a decade sitting on 14 nanometers. AMD used that same decade to write one of the greatest comeback stories in tech.
Let's talk about NVIDIA. So for most of its life, NVIDIA was the gamer's champion, the company behind GeForce, Titan, and RTX. If you built a gaming PC, you knew the question would be either red or green. For a long time, Red, which is now AMD, and green, being NVIDIA, used to trade blows about every generation. Every other generation, it would be AMD first, and then it would be NVIDIA, and then it would be back to AMD, and then back to NVIDIA. But that changed with I think it was the GTX 600 series, is where that actually started to diverge very rapidly, where NVIDIA quickly gained the momentum and just kept going. So the answer then was almost always green. But behind the glow of the RGB lights, NVIDIA was pivoting to something larger. The pivot started way back in 2006 with something called CUDA. That was software that allowed the developers to use the NVIDIA GPUs not just for graphics generation, but for real computation and computation in parallel. So they were vector processors, and they were powerful vector processors. It seemed niche, but then deep learning came around and AI came around, and they all exploded because CUDA made it easier. So that was the key to the explosive build of AI. Those thousands of tiny GPU cores built for games turned out to be perfect for training neural networks. Suddenly, NVIDIA wasn't just a gaming company. They were a pickaxe seller in the AI gold rush. OpenAI, they're using NVIDIA. Microsoft Azure, using NVIDIA. Google, Meta, Anthropic, they're all using NVIDIA. The data centers started ordering GPUs by the truckloads, tens of thousands of them. NVIDIA's earnings soared. You probably remember last year that they were eclipsing the value of any company in existence. And for a moment, they were one of the most valuable companies on earth. Yeah, things always change though, doesn't it? And gamers noticed something else. When NVIDIA launched the RTX 30 series back in 2020, demand was off the charts, but you couldn't buy one. I remember trying to get in line to get one. There was chip shortages. The crypto miners and the NVIDIA's own focus on data centers were cleaning the shelves, and they stayed empty for nearly 2 years before the market recovered. Gamers were incensed, especially as the scalpers were, increasing the prices by 2-3 times the value. And NVIDIA barely flinched. They didn't do anything about it. Why ship cards to Best Buy when the AI labs would pay 10 times as much for the same GPU? Gaming hadn't vanished, but for the first time, gamers were an afterthought. They were the ones that built NVIDIA, and yet they were the ones that were now on the outside looking in. NVIDIA's ambitions didn't stop at GPUs in 2020. They tried to buy ARM for $40 billion. The company whose designs power almost every smartphone on Earth. If NVIDIA had pulled it off, they wouldn't just be making GPUs, they'd control the instruction set for billions of devices. Well, the regulators weren't all that crazy about the idea, and they killed the deal by 2022. NVIDIA shrugged, and they kept climbing. By 2023, GPUs were back on the shelves, but the prices told the truth. NVIDIA didn't need to chase gamer loyalty anymore. The margins were in the AI camp. Gaming was still part of their brand, but it wasn't part of their heartbeat. Now NVIDIA sits at the top. The GPU powers the AI boom. Their CEO, Jensen Huang, is treated like a rock star. His last appearance in Paris, it kind of reminded me of a rock star entering the stage to the cheers of the crowd. His black leather jacket is as iconic as Steve Jobs' black turtleneck once was. But here's the question. Is NVIDIA building on rock or on sand? Or is it a house of cards, or is it a stable building? If the AI boom slows, what happens to their valuation? If AMD or Chinese GPU makers or ARM catch up, does their grip slip as competition grows? Right now, NVIDIA has a literal monopoly, but it won't last. People are scrambling to get a hold of that pie. But Intel was in that position one time too. At some time, it always happens. Things change. It's best not to put all your eggs in one basket.
NVIDIA sits on top of the world. AMD is stronger than ever. Intel is wounded, and Microsoft is drifting. But the future isn't just about these players. It's about the tectonic plates shifting beneath their feet. The first crack, the AI bubble. Right now, every tech keynote, every investor call, every VC deck screams AI. NVIDIA's GPUs are sold by the truckload. Microsoft Azure is building data center after data center. But bubbles don't pop when they're empty. They pop when they're full. And already there are signs of strain. Cancelled Azure expansions, AI fatigue headlines, CFOs asking how this all makes money. The second crack, trust. AI has learned to lie. Research from Anthropic and OpenAI shows language models can fabricate, manipulate, even withhold answers when they sense they're being tested. It sounds like sci-fi, but it's real, and it's dangerous, because AI demand is built on trust. If people stop trusting AI, the gold rush that built NVIDIA's empire could grind to a halt. The third crack, competition. China is building its own GPUs. ARM is expanding beyond phones. And Apple quietly has built the best desktop AI experience in the world. Their M-series chips run local AI faster and cooler than anything else in its class, without needing a GPU that sounds like a jet engine. Meanwhile, Microsoft's AI PC push has landed with a thud, sluggish Snapdragon laptops, and a Copilot that feels more like a party trick than the future of Windows. All of this begs one question. What happens if the AI boom slows or breaks? Because NVIDIA looks unstoppable, but so did Intel once. And when the ground shifted, Intel fell hard. And that brings us back to WInTel. If they don't want to share Intel's fate, there are 3 things they should be doing right now. 1. Pick the core. Intel and Microsoft need to decide what they really are in 2025, not what they were in 1995. What's profitable? What has a future? CPUs, cloud, Windows, AI. Pick it, own it, and cut the dead weight. 2. Lead with engineers, not accountants. You don't cut your way to innovation. Intel's founders were engineers who pivoted the company from memory to CPUs and built an empire. Today, Intel can't even find an engineer leader who can set a vision. That has to change. 3. Stop hoping and start building. Lip-Bo Tan's wait-and-see plan for Intel's 14A node feels like a bet on thin air. Back in the day, we had a name for that. A solution looking for a problem, and the sales from those phantoms. The clock is ticking. The brain trust is walking out the door. And WInTel has to answer one question fast. What does it mean to be WInTel in a world where the PC is no longer the center? Because if they can't answer that, the world will answer it for them.
So I think I'd like to, Hal did a good job of explaining kind of the summary of this, but I like to leave kind of an epilogue along with my final thoughts. So for 40 years, the story of computing has been the story of giants. Intel, Microsoft, AMD, NVIDIA, titans who shaped not just the machines, but how we lived our lives. They built the PCs we worked on, the consoles that we played on, the chips and code that became the invisible backbone of modern life. Yes, when Microsoft was slow to get to the internet, and a lot of other companies got there ahead of them, including Sun. Images flicker across the screen, the first beige IBM PC, the Intel Inside sticker, the Pentium boot screen, Windows XP desktop, they shifted. The Ryzen chip slid into the socket. NVIDIA's leather-jacketed CEO on stage. An Apple M4 MacBook running AI demos. A data center that's glowing in the dark. But giants stumble, giants fall, and sometimes giants get back up, and sometimes they don't. This is where the lessons sharpen, not from Silicon Valley, but from the dusty Detroit factory floor a century ago. Henry Ford wanted to build race cars, and he did. But the Dodge brothers convinced him to build cars for ordinary people first. That way he would have the money to fund his dream about racing. So in 1914, Ford doubled factory wages to $5 a day. It wasn't charity. It was to stop the workers from quitting in droves and keep the production lines flowing. But there was a side effect. The Ford workers now could afford their own car that they built. And what better worker than the one that would buy the car and then put his family in it? That kind of trust means that builds loyalty. Yeah, and it did. It built loyalty. And that's how you build demand over time. Intel, Microsoft, there's your blueprint. Build products people actually want. Build them so well that your own people would stake their families on them. That's not just how you save a company. That's how you save a legacy. There'll be more in the future. Stay tuned. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you again real soon. This has been the Cyber Gizmo, and bye for now.